Oh, so three. No, you're gonna give me a countdown? Not that metal finger, Rick. Okay, here we go. Yeah, good. All right. So today is October 23. This is the Bridges of Meaning Discord, and we have a pretty good group already. Just well, we're 15 minutes late. Rick hates it when we're late, but we do this pretty much every Friday. It's kind of becoming a tradition, which is nice, and it's also, I think, for the Discord a good time for people to. And I feel bad for the Australia gang because they always say, you know what time it is in Australia at 10 in the morning on Friday? Says, yeah, that's convenient for me. We should again probably find a time when we can do it when the Australia and the Asian people can be here then. But it's a good time to gather and to talk, and we do some question and answer. But again, for me, the value of doing this on the Discord is that we can have a little bit more conversation than just your standard question and answer streaming YouTube type thing. But we do have some. I only did an hour last week, and I just posted that recording on the Discord, so that I haven't posted it on my channel because I've got a lot of content. I might this afternoon post. I don't like making 2 posts a day because I already put out a lot of content, and if I start putting 2 or 3 posts a day, that gets a bit much. But I had some really cool conversations this week, and I want to share them because my conversations with you all get into my thinking and shape me, and so I like to refer to them. And if I don't share the conversation, it doesn't work. So all right, well let's jump into a couple questions. Zurich 04 from October 15 asked this: reading the Torah and Joshua, the footnotes about setting apart things as for destruction triggers the atheist deconstructionist trivial part of me. Joshua 6:17, Exodus 22, the ban, as it's often translated in the King James. When someone claims that the God of the Bible is tyrannical and genocidal based off this phrase, what are they getting wrong? As a note, one of my favorite quotes from you is, the Christianity that Dawkins objects to is the Christianity that a smart 12-year-old objects to. Actually, I should really attribute that to Jordan Peterson, because I get that from Peterson. Pastors rob. So if you want to keep your intellectual property on anything you say, don't say it to a pastor, because if it's really good, he will rip you off and not give you credit. So that's right, Josiah Gorder. Keep that in mind. This question goes down that line. I was only the smart 12-year-old 4 years ago. I've been thankful to realize that there's so much more. This is a very common problem. Skeletons in God's Closet by Joshua Butler is kind of a good book on some of this. Some of the answers to this, which I think are the best answers, offend us. And actually, the Apostle Paul gives an answer to this, which is a metaphor that says, what does the clay have to say to the potter? And so I update that metaphor. And when my kids were young, I like to play computer games. And then, of course, I get married, and my wife is like, well, I don't want you playing computer games and not paying attention to me and the Pageauian female thing. So, hey, pay attention to me. I'm your wife. Oh, okay, less computer games. But then computer games kept getting better, and I started having children. And one of the games we would play was Age of Empires, which has all these little dudes running around, and you build them, and then they all get slaughtered. And my wife is like, that's a very violent game. And it's like, oh, come on. They're just all little computer dudes, and they all get slaughtered. But we don't think anything of playing Call of Duty or Age of Empires or how many of these games where there's just simply mass slaughter. And now you might rightly say, well, human beings are not little pixels on a screen. And that's right. The irony of this problem is that on one hand, it is, like many of our other objections to Christianity, created by Christianity. because if you look at pretty much everything in the ancient world, and Tom Holland makes this point, life was cheap and people were fodder. And that's why you had slavery, and you simply used and abused and used until you wore out or discarded people. In fact, people continue to be discarded when they are inconvenient. I think that's probably the most powerful argument against this kind of a imagining abortion as birth control. People, but again, as Tom Holland has made the point, all of this came about. It's only our contemporary, deeply formed aspects of Christianity that makes us look back at God and say, hey, justify yourself. Then again, if you look at Genesis 18, I talked about this last week in the Q&A, Abraham's conversation with God, is it right for you to sweep away the just with the unjust? And you look at the kind of standard karmic assumption about good, bad, right, and wrong that we continue to maintain today. We bombed and carpet bombed Germany and dropped nuclear weapons on the Japanese. And we look at, the probably just a few hundred or maybe thousand people who are, Jericho, you know, Jericho couldn't, might not have been more than, an extended family, a village of 200 or 300 people. Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff that goes into the question of history and the numbers there. So, it's a little disingenuous for us to say, well, we had to nuke Nagasaki, and oh, I can't believe in a God that would, put Jericho under the ban. And in many ways, there's another aspect to the ban, which is if God says, go wipe out your neighbors, and by the way, you get to keep the women and children as your slaves and any goods that they have that you'd like, basically the regular plunder for war. Well, the ban is actually a little bit less corrupt, because when they go into Jericho, the God basically says, look, you're going to wipe the city out, and it's going to stand as a memorial to the fact that, and in fact, I'm going to take down the walls. The whole framing of that story of Jericho is, this is God's movement, not yours. And this movement is going to cost the lives of a whole village of innocent people, and you're not going to benefit from it commercially or economically or sexually. So there's a lot to this. I understand the power of the complaint, but again, number one, it uses Christianity against itself, which is fine. That's part of Christianity, is that we continue to critique. But there's also sort of a modernist self-forgetfulness that happens in it, whereby, oh, we think it's just horrible for God to do this to this, town of a couple of hundred people. But, well, Germany deserved it, and Japan deserved it, and, Baghdad deserved it, and now, hey, props to the United States government and to the U.S. Army and Air Force, to the care which it takes often to protect civilian lives. But it's always a mixed thing, because the drone strikes, and there are plenty of things about this. In other words, the formation of our consciences with respect to this question is all a product of Christianity. And so it's a very fair discussion, and the qualms are very fair, but we really have to see the whole thing. And there's a degree of self-forgetfulness, because I see people, that we're all about equality, except equality against whatever outgroup we are pointing to now. All these victims. Well, what about our victims? Well, they deserve it. Yeah, right. That's what everyone says. So it's a great question, and I don't find any answer dispels the issue, but those to me are how I process it. All right, next question. which is also, I just skimmed through some of these and they're really good questions. It seems one of your ideas about how to put the natural supernatural split world back together again comes from Pageau's perspective on powers and principalities, which can be described reductively in that angels, demons, and lesser gods are comparable to Uncle Sam and Santa Claus. That's right. My second conversation with Jonathan Pageau, we got into this. And because in my first conversation, I was curious about this. And so I eventually began to understand what Pageau was talking about with respect to Uncle Sam, Santa Claus, these human-made constructs, these these personalities. You know, it's so funny because when Jordan Peterson talks about, was he? It was just in the Susan Blackmore thing, which of course I rewatched recently and did a commentary on. You know, and Peterson will often say things like the best way to think about these things are as personalities, and it's like, hmm. And even going down within us, all these little sub personalities, because another question talks about the Consciousness Congress coming up later in the questions here. And so I think that for me was a super helpful understanding of person. If you recall my conversation with Nathan Jacobs, that's one of the questions I wanted to hear him talk about, and it's right there in my long conversation with him. What's a person? That's an astoundingly difficult thing to talk about. And actually, um, you know, not only is Rick quiet and behind the scenes, his brother, who is actually far less quiet at the in-person meetups, brought this question because we're wrestling with it with respect to AI. What is a person? We've got the Turing test. And so one of the things that we see is that human beings organize themselves and create constructs like Uncle Sam and Santa Claus. And it is, I think, a fair appropriation of New Testament language with respect to these things. Now, that very much leads up to the second question, which is, you know, which I very much expect and understand given our cultural context. I've heard you describe the powers and principalities surrounding contemporary America as of our own making and out of our control. And I think about this as something like school spirit. Most of us have a very real understanding of how to deal with school spirit or company spirit. We usually don't use that word, but company spirit and school spirit are basically the same thing. School spirit is a vitally important thing. Let's think of your high school. School spirit is vitally important. It's communally constructed. It's pervasive. It's 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 ontological in culture net and gets expressed physically and shapes physicality. And so that's, I think, if you can understand that, you have a real, you can begin to understand what we mean by this crazy word spiritual that we keep asking about. And so school spirit, I mean, everyone is trying to impact school spirit, and they do. The class president, the principal, the teachers, the jocks, the nerds, the potheads. Those were the main groups that we had in high school when I was growing up. So they're all trying to impact school spirit one way or another, according to where they think it should go. But none of them are really in charge of school spirit. And it's not really something that anyone can sort of take a hold of. So we participate in it, we create it, but it's also, as Jordan Peterson, I think, would help us see, centuries and centuries and centuries old. And that's really important to think about because all of our cultural stuff then goes into it. Okay, now we're getting to the rest of this question, which is an excellent question. Because all of this leads us, especially in our physicalist, materialist space, to a fear, because here is one of the main biases about our culture. We presuppositionally make an a priori assertion that says there are no spiritual beings above or beyond us. That's a bold assertion. It's an assertion that the ancient world simply would laugh at. Many in the world today it's particularly in the less developed world or in Africa, simply laugh at it because that you know they think that's the most preposterous idea. But that is again the we had an idea in the lab back when we were beginning to understand science. It's let's act as if there are no spirits or spiritual forces above or beyond us. That's basically a definition of Charles Taylor's buffered self. Okay. Let's start with that and let's use that in the lab in order to understand how reality works. The problem is sort of like a virus in a outbreak movie that got out of the lab and got into our general culture and has been infecting us. And that happened in the 18th century. And it continues to happen today, but it's passing away with modernity. All right, let me continue with the question. I've heard you describe the powers and principalities surrounding contemporary America as our own making, but not of our control, or something to that effect. For me, this way of talking about unifying the split world seems to strengthen the now decrepit modernism that says there's no split world because there never has been enchantment, right? And that would be how a modernist would read it. But I, on one hand, want us to recognize our spiritual power, which is to create school spirit, which is to create human culture, which is to create Uncle Sam. C.S. Lewis made the point that we are amphibious creatures, but the problem is here in a modernist realm, we don't have enough understanding of what we mean by spiritual to understand the spiritual power that we use. So I completely understand a modernist hears this and says, aha, well, now I have yet another way to debunk spirituality because it's just humanity. And it's like, yeah, but don't forget the dominant bias, the 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 idea that was hatched in the laboratory and escaped out into the general population and has been infecting us for almost 300 years. And it's just a raw assertion that, again, most of human history looks at and says, well, that's dumb. Have you not been paying attention? And it can only be maintained by willful blindness with respect to all sorts of things which we have relegated in our culture to low status, low important areas. Now, in all fairness to the power of that idea, there was a lot of bullshit around about enchantment. And so it's a very powerful idea and a very useful idea that created a degree of discipline amongst human beings. But we forget it's only an idea. We forget it's a act as if and live as if assumption, which is basically Jordan Peterson flips it around and says, okay, let's assume that this idea which broke out of the lab and has now infected everyone in the culture, let's live as if maybe that's not the case. And then that begins again to re-enchant people. Maybe this can also be described as everything being in the system. As I learned from your talks with Sokold, that God being outside the system is pretty important to you. How are you envisioning the Pageauian perspective unifying the split world rather than furthering it? Because it's both and. Because we not only are spiritual beings that have the capacity to create principalities and powers all around us, and we keep doing it. Human beings work that way. And that's why. So on one hand, I want us to have a deeper, richer, fuller understanding that this is reality. And that's a reality that we can fairly easily have access to. But the other reality, which is that what if we are not the only spiritual beings? What if there are spiritual beings that are older, stronger, influential? What if the buffered self is simply a symptom of the virus that got out of the lab? Now suddenly, and that's why, I look at Brett and Heather and listen to the way they're talking and think, oh, And it's C.S. Lewis's comment, if you want to stay an atheist, you got to be really careful about what you read, because that virus that broke out of the lab is regularly defeated by the the other powers and principalities that are out there. Now, again, I really love the school spirit metaphor because I think it helps materialist people connect very commonly and broadly to, okay, what do we mean when we're talking about spirit? And so Pageau was super helpful for me that way, but it's both and God is outside the system. So uh, and this is the thing. He's both outside the system, and he also invades the system. And that's the thing about the meta divine realm and Christine Hayes's observation that, so if you imagine an impersonal, non-agentic meta divine realm, it's still creating the rules. And so, and again, we're seeing that in Facebook and Google. These are platforms. These platforms are arenas, but in subtle ways, they shape the inside. And so again, the distinction, the agent arena relationship, the distinction of the two is vitally important to help understand the interaction between them. But the line between agent and arena isn't quite as, is a little bit more permeable than the idea imagines it to be. Yes, you've understood me correctly, and I think I've just clarified this. P.S. I have found the Pageauian perspective really helpful, as have I, to imagine meaningful overlapping between the sides of the split world. And so I think there is a world healing potential there. There is. And that in very many ways is the idea behind the woke movement, because the problem with woke is not that societal spirits created by us don't perpetuate injustice. That observation is dead on right. And that observation is, in some ways, kicking the stuffing out of certain places of modernism. But human beings almost always overreach. And part of, and a number of you recommended the Distributists video on New Atheism is Boring, which was a good video. But the wokeness too much assumes homie, as he said, human ontological moral innocence. It's just it's sort of a retreading of Calvinism, as James Lindsay has said, and it's a bad retread. And so if you have experience in Calvinism, you should have some understanding of the way that the system is lying to us all. It's not very different from the Calvinist who says, I'm in touch with my total depravity, and then beginning to imagine themselves an elitist who's no longer susceptible to it. And it's like, no, just knowing you're totally depraved doesn't mean you stop being totally depraved. It's a helpful thing to recognize, but if you really appreciate the depths of your depravity, um, there's potential. And so I don't, so the person who's trying to get in touch with their privilege, that's a good thing. Get in touch with your privilege, but understand you will, there are way more privileges than just sex or race. In some ways in our culture, money is the dominant privilege. So it's the problem with that system is that it just doesn't, it's just too simplistic and facile, and it's now been weaponized for cheap political gains. And the cheap political gains, I'm afraid, aren't actually going to help the people that they purport it to help. And I think Brett Weinstein is right that so you run the revolution and say, we're doing this on behalf of the victims and the poor and the underclass and whatever your oppressor group is. And then every time this program is run, it's just a new elite that comes into power. Listen to the Who song, here's the new boss, same as the old boss, because this is how we are. And I think this is It's a cheap imitation of the kenosis of Christ, where he empties himself. But here's the thing: for would-be messiahs, um, you really have to believe in the resurrection if you're going to allow yourself to be placed on a cross. And most of us say, I want to go, I want to run the Christ thing all the way up to the triumphal entry, and then we're going to kick out the Romans and we're going to be in charge and we're going to make the world better. Oh, so you've just forgotten everything that you've said about human beings and our corruption. So that's why the woke thing, well, there's a bunch of legitimacy to it, but uh, the people that I see promoting it, I was over at Kendi's website, and the main picture on his website is him standing up in front of a group, and everybody's there in tuxedos and fine clothing. And yeah, there's a nice pastel of different skin colors, but I dare bet that almost everyone in that room has way more money than almost everyone here um, in this conversation, and that isn't going to end. And so, yeah, paint me cynical about their revolution. So I found the Pageauing perspective really helpful to imagine meaningful overlappings between the sides of the split world. And so I think there is a world healing potential there, but only to a degree. I think by going all in on powers and principalities as man-made, originating, and phenomenological, and again, back to my comment, some of them are man-made, and some of them are ontological by us. And it could very well be that in terms of repetition, some of the principalities we are creating are actually very, very ancient. And this is where you get into Jordan Peterson archetypes, because principalities and archetypes are related. They're not identical. The archetypes are more the symbolic, dramatic, and then they become liturgical. But so Santa Claus, the Santa Claus archetype, isn't is probably very ancient. So, but they're not merely man-made. Um, you're risking doing what Michael Heiser critiques God, as God, often as referred to in the Bible, as the same category of the other spiritual beings. Right. I think Michael Heiser's critique is correct. God is not, and that's why God as arena, God's arenic quality is terribly important in this, because that's the uniqueness of God, is the arenic quality. There can only be one arena. And again, C.S. Lewis talks about this a bit in his book Miracles, but he's using different language. Is tantamount to creating, right, and that's why the God as arena and the arenic quality of God is vital for the uniqueness of God, and why God is not like Spider-Man or Zeus or these other things. So it's a great question. Rajdeep, what would Jesus do if he were born in a different story? Can the incarnation of the unknowable God, who is both agent and arena, really only be born in the story of the Jews? You yourself are a chessboard, and you yourself are the chessman. You yourself staged the drama in the arena of the world. You yourself elevated the players. He assumes so many forms and so many plays and so many games, and yet he remains detached from it all. We play these little mental games. What if I was born a woman? Um, I wouldn't be me. What if I was born in the 16th century? I wouldn't be me. Existence is, and we can sort of run these mental games about, oh, how would things be different if yada yada yada, and those are fun games to play, and I'm not saying they're fruitless or we don't do them well, but it is shocking. And again, C.S. Lewis points this out in his chapter on the grand miracle. Some of the things that Jesus says, if they were said in the context of just about every other culture in the ancient world besides the Jews, would have been understood in a totally different light. And so the context of Jesus is foundational in the understanding and the vocation and the role and the person of Jesus. And that's a clear message by the New Testament. And it's clear, especially in a book like the Gospel of Matthew, where the Matthew keeps connecting Jesus with Israel. And so it kind of creates this Israel into this principality and says Jesus is the incarnation of the ideal principality of Israel. Now, obviously, if you get into Christian, Jewish conversations, that gets testy. But that's the assertion of the Gospel of Matthew. And I think it's the assertion, I think N.T. Wright is correct, that that's the assertion of the Apostle Paul, that Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's story. It's and you might say, well, Jesus is the fulfillment of Babylon's story. Yeah, but context and these things matter. It'd be kind of like saying, well, what if Hitler were a pacifist? Well, he wouldn't be Hitler. So being and the details of being are consequential, and it's a fun thing to run. And actually this idea gets run many times because, of course, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints says, well, Jesus, the Jews, the Jews escaped the 10 lost tribes. And again, what's really fun is if you look at 18th and 19th century ideas in Christianity in the Americas, almost all of these ideas in the LDS church were rummaging around over in the consequence of the first and second Great Awakenings, and they get recycled and sort of brought to life in the LDS church. So what if instead of the Assyrians just mixing the Jews in with the rest of their empire, which is what the Assyrians always did, what if a whole bunch of them escaped to America? Wow, that's quite an idea. And what if Jesus came and preached to them in America? Oh, that's quite an idea. And let's write, I mean, this is going to sound horribly offensive, but when I look at the Book of Mormon, it looks like fan fiction for 18th and 19th century Second Great Awakening America burned over district. The book looks exactly how you'd imagine it would look. It's fan fiction of the King James Bible. And now we've got all these other tribes, and okay, we'll see if Tom Holland writes a history of the Mormons. Because what he basically did to Islam, that's why they were so annoyed, because if you read The Shadow of the Sword, he's basically saying, yeah, you sort of understand why Islam took the shape it did. And it's a powerful argument. It's a really annoying argument. And the thing is that Christianity has been subjecting itself to this argument for 200 years plus. And so we're sort of used to the game, and it's now come to Islam, and yeah, they don't like it much more than fundamentalists like it being done to them by modernists. So yeah, it's always an interesting question. And in some ways, Jesus does this himself, and Christianity is the story of this, because Christianity is this strange religion, unlike every other major world religion that sort of keeps its center in a certain place in the world. Christianity just keeps skipping and morphing cultures. And so the Jesus keeps getting adapted into one culture thing or another. Now, are there problems with that? Sure. Is there corruption in that? Sure. But it sort of shows the power of the religion, and part of why the religion's been so successful. So in some ways, when Jesus goes to China and Jesus goes to Japan and Jesus goes to Korea, again, I watch K-dramas with my wife and my daughter, these Korean dramas, and it's so interesting watching, like, this one very popular K-drama, the Great and Lonely God. It gets translated in English, and in Korean it's Goblin. And oh gosh, what is a goblin to us? I think about the goblins in Tolkien or goblins in European history. Well, if you look at my one conversation of the Swede who's translating Japanese, these things don't. These other traditions have very different traditions, and so goblin in Korea is a different thing, and then there's the goblin's wife, and the goblin is sort of a god, and it's just wild. And so then when Korea has this massive conversion experience, well, it's just sort of wild because when I in my church work, I often go and am a synodical deputy in Korean classes, and they're singing songs that they got from missionaries, and they're doing things that look so like they're preserving 19th and early 20th century Baptist and Presbyterian Christianity. And then there's these other Korean twists that seem to just come in from nowhere. And that's sort of how it runs. So it's a great question. How do I explain to my kids that it was okay for God to destroy the wicked in the flood in Canaan? Yeah, people complain about the Canaan flood, flood the world. But Jesus tells them to love their enemies. I think part of the reason we have difficulty with this is because we don't recognize the authority of God and distinct from our own. And it's the same reason why you can put your kid on a timeout, but the siblings can't put each other on a timeout. And you might spank your child or punish your child, and the siblings aren't allowed to punish each other. And this to me gets into this is God's right. And when you play Age of Empires, I'm going to send this whole little army of 200 little pixel guys, and they're going to get slaughtered. And people have been doing that all along. So I'd say, well, with a child, of course, I don't know that kids have as much difficulty with this as really smart 12-year-olds, because I think kids sort of naturally get authority, at least if they're being raised well. And at some point, they'll learn that authority both has its privileges and gets abused. And I think the best way for parents to model that is for parents to be good authority figures. On one hand, to raise your children to respect authority and to use authority um, to form your children, but at the same time, to not be tyrannical authorities. And when you, as parents, get things wrong, which you will do, then you apologize to your children. And again, read Genesis 18 and Abraham's conversation with God. I can't look at that. Rick's. I keep the studio monitor of the recording that Rick does, and Rick just keeps putting up these gifs and memes, and I look at them and I just smile. I should just turn off that monitor, but then I can't see Rick's smiling. Imagine, well, I guess if Rick's only living in my head, I can just close my eyes and see Rick anytime I want. That really embarrassed Rick. Rick didn't like that. Okay. Do you think that the ability to judge right from wrong comes with the gift of consciousness that Adam and Eve received to likely separate us from monkeys as chosen species by God? I think Jordan Peterson's observation about this gets really hard because we put so much weight on that story in Genesis 2 and 3. And there are all these, I mean, there's an innocent quality to Adam and Eve before the fall. But there's also a discerning quality to them. So, I think there's a reason Jordan Peterson's observations about that struck a nerve. Part of the normal village atheist questions that come up with respect to the early chapters of Genesis, I think there's a I think regard is important with respect to the image of God. And I have real doubts that we have the kind of position where we're going to be able to answer all of our questions and doubts with respect to the science religion questions that arise from those chapters. Um, but if Jordan Peterson can look at those chapters and say, wow, knowing what I know about cognitive science and human development, and I'm I'm tremendously impressed by those chapters, I think that's saying something. So, well, we are made in the image spiritually more than physically after all. See, again, do we know? Because is it anthropomorphism that we talk about God's arm or the hand of God? Y- You know, I think we need a healthy humility about the analogies that are both scriptural and ours. And I thought Brett Sockold said it very well. We can't know anything without analogy, but all analogies are imperfect. And so, does God have a body? No. But, the one, the book of Revelation, the one who is on the throne. Well, what's on the throne? Well, obviously, the throne is part of the picture. And then there's, God showing up in the temple in Isaiah 6. And but if and God's arenic and agentic aspects are there, God is free. He's gonna show up and do what he wants. It's spiritually more than physically. Even that duality, which is vitally important, stuff is so hard to navigate. So on the one hand, judgment is for God, but it is not within our rights to do so to govern the earth. Yes, it is. And I was just listening to on the Discord, a number of you mentioned Tim Mackey's Spiritual Beings interview, and I listened to about half of it. I like Tim Mackey's work. I usually point people to the Bible Project, but there's mapped and unmapped territory. A lot of the stuff that Tim Mackey is talking about, this has been known for a while, and Tim Mackey's just really good at teaching it to a broader audience. But the stuff is in John Walton's books on Genesis as well. It's basically the contemporary take on Genesis 1, that the functionaries, the sun, the lamps, the great lamp and the lesser lamp govern the sky, and humanity governs the earth. That's so evocative and foundational. So yes, we have, and Paul in Romans says this, the we tend to, just like we translate the greater and the lesser lamps as sun and moon, so also we translate and fill in the state. But what happens to the state in the period of the Enlightenment is state sort of displaces church. And part of that is because in late antiquity, church displaced state. There is an authority that was there to keep order. And yes, humans have that authority and responsibility in the world to keep order. And the whole premise of the critique of the good and bad Israelite kings, that all has to do with, we have our rights and responsibilities to govern the earth, and we ought to do so. Okay. I've observed some people, mainly on the right, saying things like, there's no such thing as truth, or there's no such thing as your truth, only the truth. However, on the left, on the However, on the more left, postmodern side, you hear the complete opposite. There's no such thing as objective truth. Both sides have a point, but I feel that they're both wrong. Peterson talks a lot about your truth in speaking your authentic true self into your existence. Yeah, the language is trying to get at something which is this is so fraught, and it's all sort of up for debate now, because also in this question of the truth versus your truth, there's also the question of which regime is in power, because the regime in power wants to talk about the truth, and the regime resisting the tyrannical power wants to talk about their truth. And what we're trying to do is deal productively and hierarchically with competing truths, because there's a lot of them, and that's why hierarchies naturally develop. So, and in modernity, of course, I mean, now if Brett Weinstein gets itchy when it comes to the word supernatural, I get itchy when it comes to the word objective. It's not that I'm skeptical about the reality of objectivity. I'm skeptical that human beings know their way around that concept really well. So, um, and one of the things that impacted me was when Rupert Sheldrake made the observation, which I didn't know about, that, oh yeah, there's an academy that maintains constants. And then he says, if they're constant, why is there an academy that has to maintain them? Oh crap. And suddenly the 18th century world just has a seismic earthquake and says, well, maybe, and again, physics has been going there. The physical world is stranger than Newton ever could have imagined. And these what personhood means is that's getting challenged by the degrees that we recognize how hackable we are, and then we're self-hackable, and what on earth does that mean? So yeah, yeah. All right. Paul's asking Paul, I am not too sure it is appropriate here. Oh, now I'm interested. Can I ask you guys opinions on female ordination? I'm quite swinging between yes and no. I wonder what PVK wonders about it as well. Answers? Well, I haven't really opened up for. I will tell you that my position is contextual. I understand why ordination in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches is different from ordination in Protestant churches. At this point, I don't think it's right for the Christian Reformed Church to block ordination of women into all offices. That's been my position for a very long time. At the same time, the position of, so the Christian Reformed Church had a huge fight about this from the 70s into the 90s, and they ended the fight with a pragmatic political compromise that is now 25 years old and continues to fester, because basically the fight never ended. And the church basically said, we don't have the tools to resolve this. When Protestants do that, they undermine their own Protestantism. And so in the Christian Reformed Church, you will find, if you go back in the archives of sermons at Living Stones, you'll find women preaching here. For most of my time here, I've tried to have somewhat equal number of female and male elders and deacons on the council. Why? because just pragmatically, I found that women elders, especially in a congregation that has a lot of women, sometimes women elders can do things with women in the congregation that male elders can't, and vice versa. And so, but this also presumes that in many ways, a Protestant church is a different thing from a Roman. The church in Protestantism is different from the church in Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy. All three have different ecclesiologies and theologies with respect to what church is. Now, it gets very interesting when I find Protestants become clergy and then suddenly look for vestments and want to appropriate a bunch of Orthodox and Roman Catholic ecclesiology. And it's like, oh, now that's getting interesting. And that gets into some of Pageau's fringe and center things. So again, it's really important. It's the same with the LGBT issues within the church. It's really important exactly what question you're asking. And so, should there be women priests in the Roman Catholic Church? First of all, it's not my place to say. Second of all, I don't know that I know Roman Catholic ecclesiology well enough. There's a reason why in the Roman Catholic Church they're called priests, and in the Christian Reformed Church they're called ministers. The priesthood of all believers is a very foundational assertion in the Protestant Reformation. Now, this stuff gets deep fast, so maybe I've been talking long enough, so maybe it's a good time to just kind of open it up to the room and hear what y'all have to say, either about this topic or anything else that I've said so far. Don't be shy.
What is a pastor, Paul?
Pastor is a shepherd who is, this gets complicated too, because is the shepherd not also a sheep? A priest is an intermediary in a very specific ecclesiastical imaginary that a pastor or a minister is not. But there are huge cross pressers within Protestantism that regularly get manifest in Protestant churches that Protestants don't like to admit, which is that Protestant churches continue to hold ministers to different standards than they hold their members to. And that gets that gets displayed in both the women's ordination fight and the LGBTQ fights. So there's tons there that is unresolved. Protestantism is an attempt to reform the Catholic Church. And it's a 500-year-old thing. That sounds like a really long time for us, but some ancient church struggles also went on for centuries. So, the Donatist movement, Arianism, lots and lots of those things. We just read about them in church history books and they seem weird and ancient and very far away, but they lasted for centuries. And this has been an aspect of the church. So, Rick's got a green screen now.
Hey, Paul, I had a question about objectivism based off your comment about like humans not being able to grasp like what is truly objective. And I think I've gotten to the place where I kind of agree with that sentiment, but I fight that with this feeling of humans not being able to acknowledge that there isn't something that is objective. And so like how do you balance that thing of like believing that there are objective truths, yet being willing to say as a human we can't know the fullness of that yet trying to pursue the things that are objective. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And we're always dealing with that in our lives. The door to my office is objective, and if a glass sliding door is objective, and if we don't see it and we try to walk through it, well, now they're harder than they used to be, but in the 70s, when sliding doors became fashionable in houses, people were walking through these things, and it was life-threatening. And so objective reality is there. And what do I mean by that? There's a reality outside of us that does not bend itself to our will. Okay. What's our capacity to know that reality? Limited. The problem is not really that there is objectivity out there. The limitations on are on our ability to know and especially wield it. So, and again, our language, just like the church, our language is in a constant state of trying to improve itself, but that's a really messy, long process that make us as little 40, 50, 60, 80, 100-year creatures look really small and just part of much bigger things. I don't know if that helped at all.
I think it did. I think my struggle with it all is trying to figure out how we navigate this dichotomy when coming to belief in something, whether it's, our political beliefs or our religious beliefs. And I think for me, like looking at it in the religious spectrum, I look at this discord and we have all of these things that people personally believe to be objectively true, yet we all contradict in certain ways. And I think growing up Protestant, there was always this emphasis on like looking at the theology and getting a consistent theology and building this objective case. And, now exploring Orthodoxy and seeing like the emphasis on authority and, trusting the church. I don't know, there's a hard balance, and how do we balance that out between this, like, trying to figure out what we personally think is objectively true versus trusting an authority and something over us to help us understand truth.
You balance it out in all the little decisions you make, and you try things, and let's say you go from Protestantism, which is a rather rebellious tradition, and you go to Orthodoxy. See, it's so interesting to look at the authority questions, because I've seen Pentecostal traditions and American Black church traditions that are so authoritarian. I mean, they really practice submission. And then I look at the Orthodox, and it's like, well, they're practicing their own form of submission too, and some of it's similar and some of it's different. It's and you work those things through. I was working on a project where we had Anglo, Korean, and Hispanic. We were leaders of different communities doing some different church work, and it was so hilarious when the Hispanic said, yeah, we're like the Koreans in terms of we have all this hierarchy in our social structures, but unlike the Koreans, we don't submit. I thought, I have both experience in Korean communities and in Hispanic communities. I thought he just completely nailed it. And life is so huge and we're so complex and it's so nuanced that, yeah, it's a powerful argument that, here the church not only in terms of the teaching, which is this abstract thing. In Protestantism, the teaching handed down through the testimony, the written testimony of the apostles. That's Protestantism, okay? And so we are going to appropriate that reading that written material and try to refabricate it in our lives. All right. From what we know now about human beings, I mean, I think about I can't think of his name right now, but this Drew, I forget his last name. It'll come up. But you know, he noted he and his friend were watching. You know, if you had to reconstruct the ancient Israelite sacrificial practices of the temple or the tabernacle based on the based on what we have in the Bible, could we do it? You know, Rick and I just today, we just got a new camera, a PTZ camera, and we've been waiting for this camera. And, you know, Rick, I get here and Rick plugs it in and it isn't working and we're fiddling around with it. And, you know, and then one of the things that the little video had said is, if your camera isn't working, your patch cable is bad. But we looked at our patch cable, said, no, this is one of the store-bought ones instead of one of the patch cables that me and Rick made, which were bad. And so then I said, well, then you're trying all kinds of things. Okay, let's use a different cable. Boom, it worked. It's like, why didn't I listen to the text? There's this, so text can communicate something, but it's a powerful argument to say, oh, but there's not just the tradition of the text, there's this other tradition. And now again, Judaism had that as well. There's the oral tradition or the tradition of the elders, or, you know, and this is apostolic succession and. But I can be skeptical about that stuff as well, and that's being a good Protestant. But so it's really complex, and so we go and we try stuff out, and we see, is it better, or how am I supposed to know if it's better? Maybe I'm fooling myself. Maybe I'm corrupt. Maybe I'm. So it's just really complex, and so I'm glad that we have the freedom to experiment. I'm glad that the Orthodox Church in America is growing and its influence is enlarging, because I think like many of us, I was sort of raised in the Protestant Roman Catholic division, and the Orthodox are like, who are these people? So it's more than any of us can ever process in our lives, but we have to live. And so live we must, and decide we must, and off we go in fear and trembling. And I don't know how to live any other way.
Paul, I wanted to ask you, what do you know, why do you think there's such a disproportionately large percentage of your audience that's drawn to Orthodoxy?
Pageau is certainly a big part of that. I think it's because, you know, Protestantism is clearly a psychologizing of the faith in terms of, you know, let's say the heaven and earth balance. And atheism, at least in the Western sense of it, is like Protestantism gone to seed. It sort of psychologizes itself away. And so then people want to once again be grounded in something. And so if you look at, so there's an Orthodox priest that's good friends with one of my colleagues up in Rockland, and someone here and comes to our meetup, goes to that church. You know, that my CRC friend and colleague was having a conversation with him talking about evangelism. Of course, Protestants go into a place and, you know, we're going to plant a church, and we're going to start by getting people together, and we'll be having Lord's Supper and preaching and all of this stuff, and the building is sort of incidental. And my friend who was a church planter, planted his church in 1991, asked the Orthodox priest about evangelism, and the Orthodox priest said, we're not ready to do evangelism yet. We don't have our cathedrals or monasteries or any of this stuff set up yet. It's like, well, there's a little difference between us, huh? So why is it that an Orthodox church has Jesus up in the dome and all the icons and all the carvings, and that's in some ways a reappropriation. When you walk into the temple, when you walk into the cathedral, you walk into sacred space. So part of the reason of the movement towards this is people, I think, at a very deep level want to reduce the percentage of psychologizing of their faith and increase the physicality and embodiment of their faith. And that's the neo-sacramentalism. And so I think that's a big part of why we see what we see happening.
But why are these people so attracted to you?
I'm available. Jordan Peterson isn't. I've sort of put a flag put a flag on YouTube and said, all right, if you want to talk about it, come on over here and we'll talk. And that's pretty much what I've done. And I've been listening to y'all and learning from y'all and having my own journey that has at least with a sufficient commonality to many of you. So that's what we're doing. I'm available. That's my guess. I don't know. And what's interesting to me is that I've had this question too, and so I asked my friend Rod, who runs Nuanced Forum, and he has ideas about it, and lots of people have ideas about why I've done, but lots of people have ideas about what I should do. I mean, Vendank has ideas about what I should do, and Rod has ideas about what I should do, and Sam and Hank, co-conspirators in Chicago, have ideas about what I should do, and Rick's got ideas about what I should do. He's always trying to up my quality, and let's build a studio and let's figure that out. So, and I'm pretty easily colonizable in some ways. I'm pretty flexible. So
I'm gonna butt in here for a second, Paul.
Okay, Joe.
Because you're saying that we and I use we in a vaguish term, that we, the people who talk to you because you're available and Peterson's not. I don't think that's true at all. And I think I speak for most of us. We watch your videos. And of course, as a connection to Peterson, we watch your videos. We like what you have to say. We think you could answer questions we have, or at least are a good person to talk to. And I think that's why we seek you out. And because we see other people talk to you and we're like, oh yeah, I'm also wrestling with this stuff, or I've been thinking about a video you've made. So I think you don't do yourself justice when you think we come to you because, well, if Jordan Peterson was available, we talk to him instead. That's not true at all, man. We talk to you because we love you and we think you have a lot of interesting things to say.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Very nice. Yeah.
Just to pile on, I listen to your stuff partially because you're one of the, I believe, few Christians who actually has a deep knowledge of Judaism.
Well, thank you. I don't know that I've earned that, but but I've spent a long time trying to understand. Most of the Bible is not the New Testament, and I find a lot of Christians don't pay any attention to most of the Bible, and it's like, no, aren't you supposed to? So thank you. That's very kind. Well, no, I think I'm in a particularly bad position to know why you listen to me, and so I think that's a better question for y'all to answer than for me to answer.
Well, I think I started listening because I felt like I had seen a bunch of people who you were talking to going through a similar thing that I was. And that was appealing to be like, oh, I'm not the only one, being in churches and feeling like that wasn't, that those conversations weren't happening in those communities. But I think just to answer Jacob's question from why I'm interested in Orthodoxy, I think growing up Protestant, I never heard about Orthodoxy. And I got to Paul's channel, and it's the first time I'm really getting any coverage on orthodoxy. And I was actually talking to Shelley about that the other day, and I kind of want to ask you, Paul, like, why is that in Protestantism we don't talk about orthodoxy? We'll talk about Catholicism. We'll talk about maybe these other like sort of off the path, like Jehovah's Witness or Mormonism, or these things that are sort of like have tenets of Christianity. But I think coming to your channel was the first time I'd really heard about orthodoxy, and I think I realized that I actually don't know anything about it. And why don't I know anything about it? And so when I started looking, I eventually really resonated with it. But why do you think that is, Paul, that people don't talk about orthodoxy?
Because we don't know much of anything about it, because they've not been a major player on the American religious sphere. So there's a really good book, Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, written by Molly Worthen. I read it a number of years ago. It's a really excellent book. One of the I can drop I just pulled it up on Amazon, so I can drop the link in the chat. Let's see, Convo's recording chat. I'll just drop that link in there. One of the things that one of the stories that she had in the book was that there was a generally speaking in America, transplant churches come when the immigrants come. And so in terms of European migration, the colonial period was almost all either transplants of state churches or transplants of dissenting churches from Europe. And many of the colonies had their own flavor with respect to this. In the 1830s, because of immigration from Italy and the Irish, suddenly Roman Catholic churches started to come, and of course Islam and other religions from other places in the world. At the opening of the Soviet Union, with the fall of the Soviet Union, America has this huge influx of people from Eastern Europe. Well, now you've got Russian Orthodox churches, and you've got churches from other former client states of the Soviet Union, and they're coming over. So in that book, Apostles of Reason, it was very interesting that in the 70s, a whole bunch of evangelicals who were sort of dissatisfied with the state of the myriad of church offerings available to them in Protestantism, and for one reason or another not terribly geeked about the Roman Catholic option, starts finding the Orthodox. And the Orthodox have answered questions in some different ways that they found very satisfying. And so in the 1970s, there was another wave of interest in Orthodoxy in the United States. So, and in many ways, the 2020s are the repeat of the 1970s in some, so this is not new. And the reason we don't know about the Orthodox is we just haven't had a lot of them around. And I'm really interested in is what's going to happen to the Orthodox that I am seeing, like Pageau and Father David. I mean, Father David from Dallas was in Len Van de Zy's been on my channel a couple of times about, same-sex marriage and stuff. And Len's a good friend of mine and a guy I deeply respect, but he was in Len Van de Zy's, was under his preaching in the South Bend CRC church for a while. I'm going to be very interested in the way these former evangelicals change the Orthodox Church, because on one hand, they're going to the Orthodox. I mean, listen to Nathan Jacobs. They're going to the Orthodox Church because their point is it doesn't change. But once you're there and you're influencing it, it will change. It might be subtle, and that change is good and healthy, or sometimes problematic, but everything changes. And so what's going to happen? And we've seen this in the Roman Catholic Church forever. And so, and some brands of Protestantism are about not changing. So I think we just haven't had enough exposure with them. And wait till they do get a chance to build their monasteries and build their cathedrals. And how's this gonna impact Christianity in America? I have no idea, but I'm excited to watch. Oh, poor Grim Grizz is going to get frustrated because
I'm here.
he's got questions here. All right, so you can, if I don't touch on your question, you can redirect me. I remember hearing stories of when under the Romans, Christians had to meet secretly in each other's homes. Given your depth of exploration, would you tell us more about that time? The Roman Empire was an enormous, diverse place. And so even, I grew up with stories of persecution under Roman times. Well, Roman times is about 1,000 years. And the more I read and the more scholarship has been done, there's been a ton of scholarship on the Roman Empire over the last 50 years. And so we're learning more and more and more. So this book that I really want to finish, if I can get a little less ADHD, is the book about money in the Roman Empire in late antiquity, because it's fascinating. The more you learn, the more granular our knowledge, the more we realize that things were so different in all kinds of different places. And so persecutions were often local for various reasons. And someone might look at our time and place and say, a Christian baker lost his bakery because he wouldn't make a gay wedding cake. Therefore, the Christians were persecuted in America. Are Christians persecuted in America? Just even asking that question now raises this enormous debate. What does persecution mean? Brett Weinstein had his Facebook account taken away. Is he being persecuted? Nobody's locked him up. So part of the, from what we know, and we don't know a lot. Again, if N.T. Wright is correct, and at least I think he probably is, and if we read the Gospel of Matthew, a lot of the New Testament scholars believed they were good. They were good Jews, and Paul was a diaspora Jew, and he believed that Jesus was the fulfillment of Israel's story. And he would go into synagogues and argue this point and talk about the resurrection. And if we're to judge anything from the book of Acts, sometimes he received a sympathetic audience, and sometimes they wanted to kill him. And so then what happens? Well, then suddenly he's splitting a bunch of these synagogues. And if you read the book of Acts again, sometimes the Christians get in trouble with the Hellenists, the Greeks, as they're called. They're not really Greek, the Hellenists. And sometimes they're in trouble with the other people that were in the synagogue, because somebody comes to Living Stones and becomes a member and starts a small group, and there's then it gets seditious. They start teaching things here that I disagree with, and so we have a church fight, and then there's a split, and it's complex. But the book, The Eye of a Needle, Through the Eye of a Needle, that was at a period around Constantine, and so there's been a lot more scholarship around this now. What really happened during Constantine, and why did he embrace Christianity, and how exactly did that change the economics of the church? It's a fascinating question. And it did change the economics of the church. And what did money mean to the people? And why build a church? And this gets into what we just talked about. Well, if you've just got a group of people meeting in a home, now Roman homes could be large places if the people were wealthy, have slaves and extended family and such. Now suddenly you've got the ability to create a building and have mosaics and imagery, and well, everything's going to change, and it keeps changing. So but that's a very different picture than what you get if you say read the book of First John carefully, which is a strange book to begin with. If you read the epistles of John, you get the sense that, as you do from the Didache, that here these Christian groups are meeting in homes, and there's these itinerant preachers, and so the Didache has this well, if it has these rules about how to deal with these itinerant preachers, and they're really interesting rules. So the church has taken on lots of different forms in lots of different contexts, and that's part of its strength. And so I try to weave some of this stuff in when I'm, doing my adult Sunday school. What's up with where two or three are gather? Yeah, I think the point of that is God's Jesus. It's as strange as Paul talking about us being in Christ. Well, Christ is then sort of like a principality, and Christ is all in all. And that pushes away from our individualism that likes to imagine, in a very Protestant way, being a Christian is thinking Christian thoughts and maybe listening to Christian music or that's that whole definitional thing. So what happens when number 4 shows up? Well, then suddenly you probably have a schism. You have 2 and 2. So it just gets into the idea that there is a collective aspect to Christ that the church manifests that can't be manifest by merely individuals. That Christ is to change fundamentally how we relate to one another, and if that isn't being practiced, then in a strange way Christ is not present. So when I hear you speak on Consciousness Congress, I don't know, Grim, you got anything to say about those answers? You want to redirect in any way?
I was hoping for more about Christians being eaten by lions and persecuted because of the way I feel society is anti-church so hard right now that people might have to start meeting in each other's homes to practice their faith. But I'm more interested. I'm ready for the next question, so by all means.
Okay. I'll tell you, when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, and I'd hear some of these breathless warnings about persecution could come to America. During the Cold War, that was always sort of imagined in the eyes of Red Dawn, that movie with Patrick Swayze, when these kids go up to the mountains and they're the Wolverines, and the Russians and the Cubans are going to come and outlaw the church. And I'll tell you, when you read the news and you see questions about religious liberty and a bill that was easily passed through Democrats and Republicans during the Clinton administration about religious liberty, nobody had a question about it. And now suddenly we have all these questions about it. I was reading Rod Dreher again yesterday, and some red state college professor asked a question of his students, should churches be allowed to discriminate on the basis, churches and religious organizations be allowed to discriminate on the basis of religious belief? And he said, it wasn't a majority, but a good number of his students wrote, no, churches shouldn't be allowed to discriminate with respect to employment about religious beliefs. And it's like, first of all, these are kids. But second of all, these kids might run the country. So yeah, we'll see how well the First Amendment holds up. But it's helpful to read American history and recognize that these things have struggled at different times and places in America before. So we'll see how they go. Can persecution come? Could be. Could be. We'll see. When I hear you speak on Consciousness Congress, things in me say, ask him about Legion. Yeah, yeah. Well, I also have a fair amount of experience working with people who hear voices. And some of the contemporary some of the theories I've heard about that is that people hear voices because they can no longer recognize their own voice in their head. And it just gets into the idea that, not only can we scale up into principalities, but we ourselves are in we have multiple personalities down below. And all they have these split brain experiments where the brains are divided in order to, like, say, stop epileptic seizures, and one side of the brain makes a decision and the other side doesn't agree with it. I heard that one side of their brain said they believed in God and the other side didn't. We're double-minded. The Bible talks about this all the time. The book of James talks about it. The Apostle Paul talks about it. Legion, well, that gets back to the earlier question about just because we as human beings have spiritual power. Now, again, there's a whole bunch of Pentecostals get excited, but I would ask them, well, what do you mean by spirit? And I'm not doubting that. So the spirit, that spirituality is not within our control, but we have spiritual influence and spiritual capacity. But also, again, not buying the idea that escaped from the lab that there are no non-embodied spiritual powers above and beyond us. Again, I think that assertion, which is just simply a naked assertion, doesn't stand up to the evidence. But the problem is, any spiritual power that is above or beyond us isn't subject to our ability to study it. Imagine my dog deciding to study me. Rick, why are you wearing a mask? Rick's over there playing games. He's in that room alone and he puts on a mask. He and I sit here all day long without masks, and he's in there by himself and puts on a mask. Are you saying something about how well you are, Rick? Anyway, see, I'm so easily distracted. So yeah, this stuff is really complicated. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about, and I'm sure I'll make videos about, is again more on this issue of personhood, because it's foundational to the Christian lines that we respect people. But part of the reason that's getting challenged is because we recognize, so I have group A and group B. Things of group A are colonizable, things of group B are persons. How much group A there is within group B. But once group B gets exhausted and debunked and deconstructed and disenchanted completely by group A, then we're into C.S. Lewis and the whole show. So Consciousness Congress, there's a whole bunch of little subpersonalities beneath us. Okay, when I first caught one of your sermon rough drafts, it stood out as he's one of the demons or epilepsy crowd. Anyone who has epilepsy will call it a demon. But again, I'm a both-ander. And so is it true that human illnesses are merely materialistic? Some of them are. Are all of them? See, here's one of the Rick. Here's one of the funny things about us is that we look at epilepsy and say, okay, well, there's, that we can put a drug in your head and stop it. Well, you can put a bullet in my head and stop it too. And when it comes to issues like mental illness or personality disorders, this line between these lines are not as clear as we walk around pretending they are. I remember I was having a conversation with a therapist once, and I was asking about a person. I said, I just kind of want to know if if it's really psychiatric or psychological. In other words, can it be fixed by a drug? And he kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, it doesn't matter. You still have to approach it the same way. Well, what does that mean? And John Van Donk has a friend who is in his 90s, and he's a retired psychologist, and he loves Jordan Peterson. He may be a psychiatrist. He's a psychiatrist. He loves Jordan Peterson. Why? Because he says, there's so much we don't know about the physical, mental relationship. And I know that sounds really wooey, but it's true. And so is our demons, is epilepsy demonic? Well, I think if you've got epilepsy, you probably say it is demonic. Can drugs help? Apparently, yes. So use them. Is it merely physical? Well, what on earth in our world is merely physical? So, is when you go into the supermarket, you see these big, huge red apples. And you might say, well, those apples are merely physical. Those apples are a product of spiritual colonizing through science and agriculture for hundreds of years to go from the things that started out that we started to use to develop into those red things. Are they physical? Sure. But this is really the key insight that Peterson sort of began in me, that the physical and the spiritual in terms of human beings are deeply intertwined. And Brett Weinstein was knocking at that door. David Sloan Wilson's knocking at that door. Jordan Peterson's knocking at that door. So to say that apple at the supermarket that is big and red and beautiful is merely physical, it's like that apple was crafted by spiritual beings that had values that are immaterial. So these, it gets sort of to Cassidy's question. You need to understand in a working way, is epilepsy, do you go to your MD if you have epilepsy? Yes. Is the existence of your MD in society merely a physical reality? Far from it. What is your take on demons? I think I've kind of answered that. How does it relate to your consciousness Congress? Jungian archetypes. I don't know Jungian archetypes that well. Archetypes seem to be these symbolic dramas that we recreate and perpetuate. And I think Jung made a strong case that these have gotten built into us. Well, what do I mean by us? John Woo, it's his fault. I think Rick is playing this game. What can I put up on the screen to sufficiently distract Paul from answering the question? Rick says, it's not me, it's Job. Anyway, Grim, go ahead. You want to pursue this?
A little bit. The reason I asked the question the way I did is because when I say the demons are epilepsy crowd, is that when Jesus was walking around healing people and expelling demons, that demons are epilepsy angle is basically, it's all just, he was just healing. He was, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Compared to like Legion and that angle.
And then they go and deny that he could do that too. If you say, okay, what Jesus did was by his word change the chemical composition permanently of this person's brain structure. No, I don't think he could do that. Well, he multiplied loaves and fishes and he stilled the storm. And so, it's so interesting how that Jesus healed him because that's epilepsy. Oh, so then it's less of a thing? So it's a great question, and it's a question that keeps coming up, and it's just funny how the demon possession is epilepsy is sort of is made to carry disenchantment water when you would say, okay, well, let's assume the person had epilepsy. So if Jesus, by speaking a word, rewired that person's brain permanently, what does that make you think about the nature of reality and the nature of Jesus' power?
Was that to the crowd or directly to me?
No, that's to anyone. That's a rhetorical question, because I hear people making that argument in terms of demythologizing. Oh, well, this person was just epileptic. Oh, okay. So it's a lesser miracle for Jesus to rewire that person's brain by saying words in the air. It's just the argument, the demythologizing argument falls apart.
I'm glad you mentioned waters. I just want to throw in one of the why I listen to you things. It's I swim in the sewage of internet, and you're trying to bring this estuary thing, and so I want to see where that comes, where some like Christian water in this cesspool ends up. It's a fascinating thing to see.
Some say the cesspool is the church, but yeah, no, it's a great question, and but what's so funny to me, and I mean, I'm not in any, what's so funny to me is that so often see, and here's the way it goes. So, okay, so part of the church, and I had a friend here at church for a while who grew up in the Church of Christian Science, and he was a type 1 diabetic. And I mean, this basically destroyed his health for the rest of his life, because for the first 7-8 years of his life, he was not allowed to have insulin or medical treatment for his diabetes. And it's and as he looked at people wearing glasses, and he's like, so I can't get insulin, but you can wear glasses. And in all fairness, it shows again, it's this idea that busted out of the lab in the Enlightenment and infected the rest of society, that there's this hard and firm line between the psychological and the physical. And there is a line between the psychological and the physical. I can't rearrange the things on my desk by thinking about it. I have to use my hands. But I do rearrange the things on my desk by thinking about it by moving my hands. So, am I moving around the things on my desk psychologically? Yeah, I'm just using my hands. Well, why does my brain move my hands? And so these boundary lines, which are really helpful, are not quite what they seem to be. And someone who comes along and says, I don't believe Jesus did miracles because these people had epilepsy and they weren't, I don't believe there are demons because these people had epilepsy and that's what Jesus healed. Oh, so you believe that Jesus could rewire a person's brain only by, using words that imagined it to be demons and then exorcising those demons from their brain. That's how you rewire a person's brain? Well, line up the epileptics and let me use Jesus' name then. It just doesn't work. The stories have Jesus doing astounding things that we say can't happen. And so what does it mean? What is it? And the whole idea, okay, demon possession, we say demon possession, okay. Let's imagine demon possession today. Okay, let's say demon possession manifested itself in marital infidelity or drug use. Oh, okay. So, well, if I can use Jesus' name and they stop cheating on their wife or stop using drugs, I'm going to use Jesus' name. Or we're going to use a 12-step program. Or we're going to use a psychotropic drug. Or we're going to use that's kind of what people are. That's what we're like. So I don't know. You can come back on this. I'm not making this adversarial at all. I'm just, it just highlights for me the poor ways in which we've talked about these things.
No, that was all excellent. Thank you for your time.
Any other comments on that? I'm just about out of time, so Topher's salty. All right, I'll get down to did we get into any of today's questions? No, I guess we'll have to wait for them. How did Jung, Tolkien, Campbell, and Fry discuss dispensationalism, end time movements in the church? I have no idea. Dispensationalism is a product of the modernist fundamentalist fight, and ironically, often the products of these wars manifest what they attempted to resist. And yeah, so I have no idea. Next question. Don't rush it, Paul. Okay, Job, you got anything? Actually, I've got 5 more minutes, and so we'll do a Quaker thing, and we'll just sit here in silence until something manifests in the room. That made Rick laugh.
Talking about manifesting in the room. You manifested in my life almost exactly the moment that you started. And a friend of mine came around and said, "Oh, have you seen this Jordan Peterson thing with Kathy Newman?" And then I looked for a Christian response, and there you were. My wife now thinks I've got a serious addiction to you.
Well, is she comforted that I'm not not a supermodel or something like that?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Bald-headed men, and then actually the next thing that caught me, sad to say, is Job.
Mm-hmm.
Job,
yeah.
In that very first video and the second video that happened quite soon afterwards, when I saw the transformation, and I could see that. I mean, I used to be overseas in missions, and one of the things you look for in people is a call. And you get trained. Your eye gets trained to look for people who got his teeth into. Sorry, Job, but you've been badly bitten, badly bitten, and that gripped me. That actually, just a chat with someone at that deep philosophical level, and that sudden change that he'd had to face, that things might be different, made him become on a path of pilgrimage towards Jesus. And I wanted to start that myself. I actually tried setting up I did exactly what you did, put it out on Meetup, and no one came. I had 3 people over 4 months, all on different months, of course. And my other church elders sat there and thought, "No, this is completely mad." And I probably agreed with them after a while, but but that's what got me. It was the initial wisdom about thinking about what Jordan Peterson was saying. Obviously, the Jordan Peterson biblical series was just mind-blowing anyway. And then actually seeing someone transformed.
Yeah.
That's what made it happen. And that's why Estuary, to me, yes, if we can replicate it, great, let's do it. Because there's a whole generation or two down below where I am. I'm just about to hit 60. Who are just desperate for Jesus, but don't even know his name other than a swear word.
Yeah. No, well said. And duplicate. I don't know if we duplicate, but we I think we imitate and we rhyme. So, and that's why. So John Van Donk, you know, is willing to give his time to start a little Zoom group to talk about these things, and people who want to start fishing around with these ideas and practicing them. Anything in here, my situation in Sacramento, it's all going to be unique because I'm unique, but that's why I have resisted sort of a mechanistic approach to this. Here's the 5 ways to do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You too can start a Jordan Peterson meetup group, and it'll be just like mine in Sacramento. It won't be anything like the Sacramento group because we've got a Rick, and we've got a Mike, and we've got a Joey, and we've got a Tyler, and we've got a James, and all of these are individuals. And so what I want us to do is open ourselves up to what can happen along these same lines. So yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it.
I think what's also important with that is you haven't got a Job, you haven't got an Andreas, and you haven't got a Ginger Bill in your group.
Right.
And that also is a difference. And I think that's what we tend to think about, oh, the people who are there make it, but actually the people who aren't there also make it.
Right.
And I think that's something we need to wrestle with. It's quite interesting. I'm just finished you and Job talking recently, and it's just like, yeah, when people meet up, that's really vital that Job was talking about.
Yeah. And
it's the conversation that continues from a multi-conversation.
Yeah. And you know, I was just talking to someone who, I mean, their group just keeps filling up with Christians. And they're like, we don't have enough atheists. And it's like, I got, you know, Rick and I are the only ones at Living Stones on Sunday morning from our group. And James goes to another, you know, and Rick's only here because no, that's not true. Rick can't not be here or the video won't work. Rick isn't getting a vacation. But everyone's going to be different. And so, yeah, that's that. And that's part of the reason why I use a natural metaphor like estuary, because the world is full of estuaries. If you drive down the California coast on Highway 1, you'll see all these little streams and creeks going out into the Pacific, and every single one of them is unique. There's commonalities, there's similarities, but every single one is unique. The California Delta is a massive one. So the world is full of estuaries, and there are patterns within them, but every one is unique. And I just want to see Christians get out into the world and be helpful. So, well, that's the end of the regularly scheduled program. So I'll have Rick end the recording, and then we can chat. Well, he ended the recording.